A fast food employee was fired for giving food to a needy boy. Years later, a well-dressed man showed up at her house saying, "Here is the key to your new apartment." It was a slow, rainy Tuesday night at the Burger Buddy on the corner of 7th Avenue in Maine, and Emily Ward stood behind the counter, wiping it down with an absent-minded rhythm. The smell of grease, overcooked fries, and the faint trace of burnt coffee permeated the air, blending into the scent of cheap cleaning products she'd been using all day. Her brown hair was pulled back into a tight ponytail, her apron splattered with ketchup and mustard stains that seemed to have become a permanent part of her uniform. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered every few seconds, and the old ceiling fan buzzed softly, pushing the stale air around the empty restaurant. Emily glanced up at the clock, 10:17 p.m. 43 more minutes until closing. 43 more minutes until she could take off her shoes, with their worn-out soles, and rest her aching feet. She was bone-tired, the kind of exhaustion that comes not just from a long day of work but from the weight of life itself. Yet she was used to it by now. Exhaustion had become her steady companion. At 32, Emily felt far older than her years. Life had a way of doing that to people like her, she supposed. People who, for one reason or another, never quite got their footing. 10 years ago, things had looked so different. She had been in college, studying literature, with dreams of becoming a teacher. Back then, the future had seemed full of possibilities, each day a new chapter waiting to be written. But then her mother got sick and everything changed. The illness had started gradually, with small things. Her mother, who had always been so sharp, began forgetting simple tasks like turning off the stove or where she had left her keys. Emily had ignored it at first, chalking it up to stress or aging, but the forgetfulness soon turned into confusion, and the confusion turned into moments of disorientation. When her mother started wandering off, not remembering where she was, Emily knew something was seriously wrong. The doctors diagnosed early-onset Alzheimer's, and Emily's world was flipped upside down. She dropped out of college to take care of her mother full-time, thinking it would be temporary. But the disease progressed faster than anyone had expected. The bills piled up, and with no degree, no stable job, and no financial safety net, Emily found herself trapped in a cycle of low-wage work and caregiving. For years, she had worked whatever job she could find, waiting tables, cleaning houses, retail, anything that would pay just enough to cover the rent and her mother's medication. The Burger Buddy job was just the latest in a long line of dead-end positions, but it had one perk. It was close to home, allowing her to rush back during her breaks to check on her mother. Her neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, would sometimes come over to sit with her mother during the longer shifts. But Emily hated relying on her. She was just another older woman in the neighborhood with her own problems. Emily sighed, leaning against the counter and staring out into the dark, rain-soaked street. The drizzle outside had turned into a steady downpour, streaking the windows with water and making the empty road shine under the streetlights. On nights like this, business was slow. Not many people ventured out for greasy burgers and fries in the middle of a storm. She liked these quiet moments, though. It gave her time to think. Even if her thoughts often drifted to the things she tried to avoid, the stack of unpaid bills on the kitchen counter, the groceries she couldn't afford, the constant fear of losing their tiny apartment. The apartment. It was another reminder of how far her life had fallen off course. She and her mother had lived there for nearly 5 years now. It was a cramped, 2-bedroom unit in a building that always smelled faintly of mildew, no matter how often Emily scrubbed the walls. The windows were drafty, the heater barely worked, and the walls were so thin she could hear her neighbors fighting at all hours of the night. But it was home. It was the best she could afford, and even that was becoming a struggle. She'd had to take out a payday loan last month just to cover the rent, and now the interest was piling up, creating a new debt she had no idea how to pay off. And then there was her mother. The woman who had once been so independent, so lively, was now a shell of her former self. Emily tried to remember her as she had been, strong, witty, always with a book in hand. But these days, all she could think about were the blank stares, the vacant smiles, and the moments when her mother didn't even recognize her. It hurt in ways Emily couldn't describe. But she had learned to bury that pain deep inside. She had to. There was no room for breaking down when you were the only one holding everything together. As Emily's thoughts drifted, a figure outside caught her attention. A boy, maybe 12 or 13 years old, stood just beyond the glass door, hunched under the awning to stay out of the rain. He was wearing an oversized jacket that looked several sizes too big, and his shoes were caked with mud. His hair was damp, clinging to his forehead in messy strands, and his face was pale, thin, and gaunt. She had seen him before, lingering around the restaurant on a few other nights. He never came inside, just stood outside watching. She had assumed he was waiting for someone, but now, seeing him like this, she realized he probably wasn't waiting at all. He was hungry. Emily's heart clenched. She had been hungry like that before, back in the worst days, when the rent was overdue and the only food she had was whatever leftovers she could sneak home from the diner where she used to work. She knew what that kind of hunger felt like, the hollow, aching kind that made your body feel weak and your mind hazy. She glanced around the restaurant. The manager, Mr. Halverson, had already gone home for the night, and the only other employee, Jakey, was in the back taking inventory. There were no customers, no one to see, no one to stop her. Without thinking, she grabbed a burger from the warmer and still fresh from the last order. She added a side of fries, wrapping them up neatly before reaching for a cup and filling it with soda. Her heart raced as she moved. She knew what she was doing was against company policy. They weren't supposed to give away free food, ever. It was one of the first rules they were taught during training. But what was she supposed to do, turn him away? Let him go back into the rain with nothing? Emily pushed open the door, stepping out into the cold night air. The rain was lighter now, but the wind was sharp, cutting through her thin uniform. The boy startled slightly when he saw her, his eyes widening as he took in the food she was holding. "Here," she said softly, holding out the meal. "It's for you." For a moment, the boy didn't move. He just stared at her, his expression a mix of surprise and confusion, as if he couldn't believe she was offering him food. Slowly, his small, trembling hand reached out, taking the wrapped burger from her. His fingers were cold and dirty, the nails bitten down to the quick. "Thank you," he whispered, barely audible over the rain. Emily nodded, watching as he tore into the burger, devouring it with the kind of urgency that told her he hadn't eaten in days. She stood there, her arms wrapped around herself, feeling both helpless and determined at the same time. She wanted to do more, but what could she do? She was barely surviving herself. "Do you have somewhere to go?" she asked after a minute, though she already knew the answer. The boy shook his head, stuffing the last of the burger into his mouth. He wiped his hands on his jacket, then shoved his hands deep into his pockets, avoiding her gaze. "There's a shelter on Maple Street," Emily said gently. "It's just a few blocks from here. You can stay there for the night. They'll help you." The boy nodded, but Emily could tell he wasn't planning on going there. She wanted to press him, to insist that he go somewhere safe, but she knew better than to push. Kids like him, kids who had learned to survive on the streets, they didn't trust easily. He finished the fries, stuffing the empty wrapper into his pocket, and mumbled another thank you before turning and walking away, disappearing into the shadows of the night. Emily watched him go, her heart heavy. She wanted to run after him, to do more, but what more could she do? She was already risking her job by giving him the food. She couldn't save him. She couldn't even save herself. The next morning, her worst fears came true. Emily sat in her manager's office, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as Mr. Halverson, her boss, paced back and forth in front of her. His thinning hair was combed over in an attempt to hide the bald spot that had only grown larger over the years. His face was twisted in a permanent scowl, his arms crossed tightly across his chest. "Emily," he began, his voice cold and flat. "We need to talk about what happened last night." She sat up straight, her hands resting on her lap, already knowing where this was going. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. "I know what you're going to say," she started. "But no," he interrupted sharply. "You don't know what I'm going to say. What I'm going to say is that you broke company policy. You gave away food without authorization. That's theft, Emily." Her stomach churned. "It wasn't theft. He was just a kid. He was starving. I couldn't just—" "You could have followed the rules," Halverson snapped, his face growing red. "You could have called someone, like the police or child services. You could have done a dozen other things besides stealing from this company." Emily's eyes stung with unshed tears, but she blinked them away, refusing to cry in front of him. "He was hungry," she said quietly. "I just wanted to help," Halverson sighed, shaking his head. "That's not your job, Emily. Your job is to follow the rules. And you didn't. I'm sorry, Kun, but I'm going to have to let you go. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Fired to just like that. She stared at him, unable to speak. Her mind racing with the implications. No job meant no income. No income meant no rent. No rent meant she and her mother would be out on the street. She felt the walls closing in around her, the panic rising in her chest, but she swallowed it down. She stood up slowly, her legs feeling shaky beneath her. Okay, she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Halverson didn't say anything as she walked out of his office and back into the restaurant. Jacob, the other employee, looked at her with wide eyes, but she avoided his gaze, grabbing her coat and leaving without another word. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the sky was still gray and heavy, much like the weight pressing down on her chest. She walked home in silence, her mind numb, replaying the conversation over and over again in her head. She had done the right thing, she knew that. But why did it feel like the world was punishing her for it? That night, as she sat on the edge of her bed staring at the bills piled on her kitchen table, Emily thought about the boy. She wondered if he had found his way to the shelter. She wondered if he had eaten anything else since the meal she had given him, and she wondered if she would ever recover from the decision she had made. As the days passed, she would find herself asking that question more and more. The days following Emily's firing were a blur of worry, frustration, and helplessness. Without the meager paycheck from Burger Buddy, the already precarious balance she had managed to maintain collapsed. The rent was due in less than 2 weeks, and she had barely enough savings to last through the month. The medical bills for her mother's condition were piling up, and the loan sharks were starting to call. Every time her phone rang, a knot formed in her stomach, knowing it was likely another collector demanding money she didn't have. The apartment itself, once her refuge, now felt like a prison. The chipped paint on the walls, the worn-down furniture, and the faint smell of mildew seemed to suffocate her. She would sit in the small kitchen, staring at the unpaid bills, trying to figure out a plan. But no matter how many times she added and re-added the numbers, they never worked out in her favor. She applied for jobs everywhere. Grocery stores, gas stations, cleaning companies, any place that had an open position. But nothing seemed to stick. No one was hiring, or if they were, her lack of a degree and her gap in steady work history made her an undesirable candidate. Every rejection felt like another door slamming in her face, pushing her further into a corner she couldn't escape from. Her mother's condition was worsening too. There were days when her mother didn't even recognize her, calling her miss or asking when Emily would come home, not realizing her daughter was sitting right next to her. On better days, they would watch old TV shows together, her mother laughing at the jokes as if nothing had changed, as if the past few years hadn't stolen pieces of her away. Those moments gave Emily a flicker of hope, but they were always fleeting, quickly replaced by the cold reality of the disease's relentless progression. One morning, as Emily was sitting at the kitchen table, her mother shuffled into the room, her eyes distant and unfocused. She stopped in the doorway, looking at Emily as though she were a stranger. "Where's my daughter?" her mother asked, her voice trembling with confusion. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing a smile as she stood up and gently took her mother's hand. "I'm right here, Mom," she said softly, "and it's me." "Emily." Her mother blinked, staring at her for a long moment before recognition seemed to return. "Oh, Emily, I didn't know it was you," she murmured, her voice heavy with embarrassment. She sank into the worn armchair by the window, her hands fidgeting nervously in her lap. Emily watched her mother, her heart breaking all over again. This was the woman who had raised her, who had worked 2 jobs to put food on the table and still managed to make Emily feel loved and cared for. Now, she was fading away bit by bit, and there was nothing Emily could do to stop it. The sound of the phone ringing interrupted her thoughts. She glanced at the caller ID and saw the name of her landlord flashing on the screen. Her heart dropped. Rent was due in 3 days, and she didn't have the money. She knew what the call was about, but answering it wouldn't change anything. She let it ring. A week later, Emily found herself standing in line at the food pantry. It was her first time there, and the weight of her situation hung heavy on her shoulders. The room was filled with people, most of them looking just as worn down by life as she felt. Mothers with young children, elderly couples, men and women who looked like they had seen better days. They all shuffled forward slowly, picking up canned goods, bread, and whatever else the pantry had to offer. Emily stood with her arms crossed, staring at the shelves lined with food that felt like a symbol of her failure. She never thought she would end up here, depending on charity just to feed herself and her mother. But pride had no place in survival, she reminded herself. She had to do what needed to be done. Next, the volunteer at the counter called out, and Emily stepped forward, her eyes scanning the items in front of her. She picked up a few cans of beans, some rice, and a loaf of bread, trying to hold back the wave of shame that washed over her. As she turned to leave, the volunteer, an older woman with a kind face, smiled at her. "Hang in there, dear. Things have a way of turning around," the woman said, her voice warm and encouraging. Emily managed a weak smile. Though she didn't believe it, things hadn't been turning around for her in a long time. Still, she nodded and thanked the woman before heading out into the cold November air. The sky was a dull gray, threatening rain, and the chill in the air seemed to seep into her bones. As she walked back to her apartment, clutching the bag of groceries tightly, her mind wandered to the boy from that night at Burger Buddy. She hadn't seen him since then, and she wondered if he had found his way to the shelter or if he was still out there, wandering the streets alone. The memory of his thin face and hollow eyes haunted her. She had only given him one meal, but what had happened to him after that? It seemed unfair that someone so young could be in such dire straits. But then again, life wasn't fair. It wasn't fair that her mother was slowly losing herself to a disease that had no cure. It wasn't fair that Emily had to drop out of college and abandon her dreams to care for her. It wasn't fair that, despite working as hard as she could, she still couldn't get ahead. Life wasn't fair. And yet, what could she do but keep moving forward? Back in the apartment, Emily unpacked the groceries and made a simple meal for her and her mother. They ate in silence, the only sound coming from the small TV that played reruns of an old game show her mother liked. After dinner, Emily helped her mother to bed, tucking her in and making sure she was comfortable before heading back to the kitchen to clean up. As she scrubbed the dishes, her mind wandered to the job application she had sent out. There had to be something, anything, that would give her a break. She couldn't keep scraping by like this. The stress was eating away at her, and she was starting to feel like she was unraveling at the seams. She wiped her hands on a towel and sat down at the small kitchen table, opening her laptop to check her email. Her heart sank as she scrolled through the messages. More rejections. Each one was a reminder that she was stuck, unable to move forward, unable to find a way out of the mess her life had become. It was just past midnight when Emily finally crawled into bed, the weight of the world pressing down on her. She stared up at the ceiling, her mind racing with worries about the future. How long could she keep this up? How long before everything came crashing down completely? Her thoughts drifted to the boy again, and she wondered, not for the first time, if he had found help. She had tried to do the right thing by giving him that meal, but in the end it hadn't made a difference for either of them. He was still out there, somewhere, and she was still here, barely holding on. With a heavy sigh, Emily closed her eyes, trying to will herself to sleep. But even as she drifted off, the worries stayed with her, lingering in the corners of her mind like shadows. The following days passed in much the same way. Emily searching for jobs and caring for her mother, and trying to stretch what little money she had left. The constant pressure weighed on her, making it hard to focus, hard to feel hopeful about anything. But amidst the grind, there was one unexpected silver lining. It came one evening, when she was sitting on the couch next to her mother, who was dozing off after dinner. Emily had her laptop open, half-heartedly scrolling through job listings when her phone buzzed. It was a message from an old friend she hadn't heard from in years, Claire. Claire and Emily had been close in college before everything fell apart. They had shared classes, late-night study sessions, and countless conversations about their dreams for the future. But when Emily dropped out, she lost touch with most of her friends, including Claire. The message was simple. "Hey, it's been a long time. I saw your post about looking for work and thought I'd reach out. I'm managing a small bookstore downtown, and we might have an opening soon. Let me know if you're interested." Emily stared at the screen, her heart leaping with a mix of surprise and cautious hope. A job at a bookstore? It wasn't glamorous, but it was something more than that. It was a reminder that not everything was lost, that there were still people who cared, still opportunities waiting for her if she kept trying. She quickly typed a reply, thanking Claire and expressing her interest. As she hit send, a small smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. It wasn't much, but it was a glimmer of hope, something she hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time in weeks, Emily went to bed that night with a feeling that maybe, just maybe, things were starting to shift. But little did she know, this small flicker of hope was only the beginning of something much bigger, something that would change her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. 2 weeks passed, and Emily's life had settled into a fragile routine, an exhausting, tenuous rhythm of balancing her new part-time job at the reading nook with the care of her mother. The stress of unpaid bills, her mother's declining health, and the constant pressure to find more stable work weighed heavily on her. The good news from Claire about the bookstore position had been a glimmer of hope, but it was only a small step forward in a much larger battle. Emily had learned not to dwell on the weight of her problems, though. Dwelling led to despair, and despair didn't pay the bills. She was in survival mode, moving from one task to the next with a kind of mechanical determination. Wake up, make her mother breakfast, check job listings online, rush to the bookstore, return home, prepare dinner, repeat. The days blurred together, and the relentless routine became her shield against the fear that loomed over her life like a dark cloud. Despite the financial struggles, the bookstore had brought her something she hadn't felt in a long time, a small sense of peace. The quiet atmosphere, the smell of paper and ink, the low murmur of customers browsing the shelves. Emily found herself escaping into those moments, however brief, when the weight of her responsibilities faded into the background. For a few hours each day, surrounded by books in the warm, inviting ambiance of the reading nook, she could almost believe that everything was going to be okay. Claire had been understanding of Emily's situation, offering her flexible hours that allowed her to care for her mother. They had slipped back into an easy friendship, as though no time had passed since their college days. Claire would often chat with her after the shop closed, reminiscing about the past and catching up on the years they had missed. It was a comfort Emily hadn't realized she needed, someone who remembered her before her life had become so hard, someone who still saw her as more than just a caregiver or a struggling woman trying to stay afloat. One cold Saturday morning, Emily arrived at the bookstore a little earlier than usual. Snowflakes were starting to fall gently outside, the kind that clung to your hair and melted on your skin, reminding her that winter was settling in for good. Inside the shop, it was warm and cozy, with soft classical music playing in the background. Claire was in the back, unpacking a new shipment of books, while Emily worked the front counter, helping the occasional customer find what they were looking for. By mid-morning, the shop had gotten busier. Emily was chatting with a customer about a newly released mystery novel when the sound of a TV in the back corner caught her attention. Normally, the television in the store played muted news or cultural programs, background noise that blended into the quiet hum of the bookstore. But today, something made her pause. The headline on the screen was bold and eye-catching. Cleveland's own Marcus Jenkins signs multi-million-dollar contract, from homelessness to NBA stardom. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She stared at the screen, feeling a sudden jolt of recognition. There, on the television, was the face of a man she had never expected to see again. The boy from the Burger Buddy, now a tall, athletic man with a bright smile and eyes that were filled with something she hadn't seen in him before. Confidence. Success. For a moment, Emily felt disconnected from reality. Was it really him? The same boy she had given food to all those years ago? Her mind raced, trying to reconcile the image of the hungry, rain-soaked child with the confident, well-dressed man, now being interviewed by reporters. The customer in front of her asked a question, but Emily didn't hear it. Her focus was entirely on the screen. She watched, frozen, as the camera zoomed in on Marcus. He stood in front of a group of reporters, his broad shoulders filling the frame, looking every bit the star athlete he had become. His smile was genuine, his posture relaxed, and the words he spoke sent a chill down Emily's spine. "I wouldn't be here today without the help of so many people," Marcus said, his deep voice carrying an emotion that made the reporters lean in closer. "There were a lot of tough days, especially when I was a kid. I spent years on the streets, not knowing where my next meal was coming from. But people helped me along the way. A kind word, a hot meal, a place to sleep, those things kept me going." Emily's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced back to that night, the memory of it vivid and clear now, as if it had just happened yesterday. The rain, the cold, the way his small, trembling hands had taken the food from her, she had never forgotten the look in his eyes. So much hunger, fear, and hopelessness. Marcus continued, his voice softer now, filled with gratitude. One of the first people who helped me was a woman. I don't even know her name. I was just a kid standing outside a fast food place, starving. She gave me food, even though I knew she could get in trouble for it. That small act of kindness, it might not have seemed like much to her, but to me, it was everything. It made me believe that maybe there was still good in the world. Emily's hand instinctively went to her chest, her heart pounding as she listened. He was talking about her, there was no doubt. She could feel it deep in her bones, the connection between that night and the man standing in front of the cameras, sharing his story with the world. And now, Marcus continued, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips, I've made it my mission to pay that kindness forward. I want to give back, especially to kids who are going through what I went through. They deserve a chance, just like I got mine. The interview ended, and the screen switched to highlights of Marcus playing basketball, making slam dunks and leading his team to victory. But Emily couldn't tear her eyes away from the television. Her mind was reeling, her thoughts a chaotic swirl of disbelief and emotion. She had always wondered what had happened to that boy. She had replayed that night in her head so many times. Especially after losing her job because of it. She had questioned herself, doubted whether it had been worth it. And now, here he was, living proof that her small act of kindness had mattered, that it had made a real difference in someone's life. Emily? Claire's voice pulled her out of her trance. She blinked, realizing that she had been staring at the television for several minutes, lost in her thoughts. The customer in front of her had moved on, and Claire was standing next to her, a look of concern on her face. Are you okay? Claire asked, her brow furrowed with worry. Emily nodded slowly, though she wasn't sure she fully believed it herself. Yeah, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I think I know him. Claire glanced at the TV where the sports segment was still playing. Marcus Jenkins, the basketball player? Yeah, Emily said, her voice thick with emotion. He was just a kid when I met him. I gave him food one night, years ago. He was homeless. I didn't think much of it at the time, but that was him. Claire's eyes widened in surprise. You gave him food? Emily, that's incredible. You've got to be kidding me. Emily shook her head, her mind still processing everything. I can't believe it either. I didn't even know his name back then. I just knew he needed help. Claire placed a comforting hand on Emily's shoulder. You made a difference in his life. Look at him now. Emily exhaled deeply, a mixture of disbelief and pride swelling in her chest. She had spent so many years feeling like she was barely making it, like all her efforts, all her sacrifices were for nothing. But here was proof that, in at least one person's life, she had made a lasting impact. Still, even as the realization settled in, there was a part of her that felt conflicted. Marcus had risen to fame, to success, while she had fallen further into struggle. Life had taken them in two very different directions. She didn't resent him, far from it, but the contrast between where he was now and where she remained left her feeling raw, exposed, and unsure of how to process it all. That evening, Emily sat in her apartment, the glow of the TV casting soft shadows across the room. Her mother was asleep and the apartment was quiet, too quiet. Emily found herself replaying Marcus's interview in her mind, wondering what would have happened if she had turned him away that night. Would he have found help elsewhere? Would he have survived long enough to get off the streets? Or would that small meal have been the difference between hope and despair? The questions haunted her, but they also gave her something she hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of purpose. Maybe she couldn't fix everything in her life right now. Maybe she couldn't control the bills piling up, or the relentless march of her mother's illness. But she had done something good, something that had rippled outward in ways she could never have predicted. As she sat in the dimly lit room, a soft knock at the door startled her. Emily frowned, glancing at the clock. It was late hen and she wasn't expecting anyone. She opened the door cautiously, and standing there, illuminated by the hallway light, was a tall man in a sleek suit. He was older now, his face more defined, his frame broader, but there was no mistaking him. Marcus Jenkins stood in front of her, holding an envelope in his hand. Hi, he said, his voice gentle, his eyes filled with recognition. I think you remember me. Emily's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she couldn't speak. She just stared at him, her heart pounding in disbelief. I've been looking for you, Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. For years. I've never forgotten what you did for me. He held out the envelope, and as Emily took it, her hands trembling, he smiled softly. This is for you, he said. It's the key to your new apartment. Consider it a thank you for everything. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she stared down at the envelope in her hands, her mind reeling with the enormity of the moment. All the years of struggle, all the doubt, the fear, the uncertainty, they melted away, replaced by something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Emily stood frozen in the doorway, her fingers gripping the envelope Marcus had just handed her. The familiar weight of disbelief settled in her chest as she tried to make sense of the moment. There, on her doorstep, stood a man who had risen to stardom, a man who had defied the odds. And somehow, incredibly, he was here because of her, because of that one night all those years ago. The shock and emotion that had been building inside her now threatened to overwhelm her. Her mind struggled to comprehend it all. She had always imagined the boy she had helped fading into the city's faceless crowd, surviving in ways she'd never know. She had long accepted that what she did for him that night was a fleeting moment, one of countless acts of kindness lost to the world. But now that moment had come full circle. Marcus. Her voice was barely a whisper, as though speaking his name out loud would shatter the fragile reality of what was happening. I can't believe it's you. Marcus smiled, a warm, genuine expression that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. His presence filled the small hallway, his broad shoulders seeming too large for the modest apartment. Despite his towering frame, there was a humility about him, a kindness that reminded Emily of the boy he had once been. It's me, he said softly, his gaze never leaving hers. I've been looking for you, Emily. I didn't know your name for a long time, but when I made it out, when my life started to change, I never forgot what you did for me. Emily's breath caught in her throat, the emotion too much to bear. She shook her head slowly, trying to find the words. I didn't do anything special. It was just a meal. Marcus stepped forward, his expression softening, his voice filled with emotion. It was so much more than that meal, it was hope. I was at my lowest point, and you didn't just give me food. You treated me like I mattered. You saw me. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, blurring her vision. She blinked rapidly, trying to hold them back, but they came anyway, spilling down her cheeks. She felt raw, vulnerable, and completely overwhelmed. The struggles she had endured, the sacrifices she had made, none of it had ever felt like it amounted to anything. But here, in this moment, with Marcus standing in front of her, it was as though all those years of hardship had been leading to this. I've thought about you a lot, Marcus continued, his voice soft but steady. After that night, I went to the shelter you told me about. It wasn't easy, but that meal got me through the night. It was the first step in a long road. From there, a social worker found me and got me into a youth program. That's where I discovered basketball. He paused, glancing down at the floor for a moment before meeting her gaze again. Basketball saved my life. It gave me something to focus on, something to work toward. But it all started with you. You gave me the strength to keep going. Emily wiped her tears with the back of her hand, her heart aching with both joy and disbelief. She had always wondered if that boy had made it out of the cycle of poverty and desperation. She had always hoped he would, but deep down, she had known the odds were against him. Now standing here, she realized that hope wasn't always in vain. I don't know what to say, Emily whispered, her voice trembling. I never expected... Marcus shook his head, stepping closer until he was standing right in front of her. You don't have to say anything. You've already done more than enough. He glanced down at the envelope she still held in her hands. That's for you. I know things have been hard for you, Emily. I've done my homework. He smiled gently, his tone lightening. I didn't want to show up empty-handed. Emily looked down at the envelope, her hand still shaking as she slowly opened it. Inside was a key attached to a sleek brass keychain. Underneath the key was a folded piece of paper, an official document. Her eyes scanned the words, and the realization hit her like a wave. It was the deed to a new apartment. She looked up at Marcus, her mouth opening to protest, but he held up a hand before she could speak. "I know what you're going to say," he said with a soft chuckle. "You're going to say you don't deserve it, that it's too much. But it's not too much. Not for what you gave me." He gestured around the small, worn apartment, his expression serious. "I've been where you are, Emily. I know what it's like to struggle every single day, to wonder how you're going to make it to the next one. You gave me hope when I had nothing, and now it's my turn to give something back." Emily stared at him, her chest tightening with emotion. She could hardly believe what was happening. This wasn't supposed to be how life worked. People didn't just show up and change your world like this. But here he was. This boy she had helped. Now a man who had risen to unimaginable heights, offering her a lifeline when she needed it most. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "You already have," Marcus said softly. "You thanked me the moment you handed me that meal." Emily looked down at the key in her hand, her heart full to the brim with gratitude. She felt as though the weight of the world had been lifted from her shoulders, even if just for this moment. For the first time in years, she didn't feel trapped by her circumstances. She felt free. Marcus smiled warmly, then took a step back. "I've got to head out soon, but I wanted to see you in person, to tell you that what you did mattered, more than you'll ever know." Emily nodded, still too overwhelmed to speak. She watched as Marcus gave her one last smile, then turned and walked down the hallway, his figure disappearing into the night. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Emily standing alone in the dim light of the apartment, the key still clutched in her hand. For a long time, she stood there in silence, the gravity of the moment slowly sinking in. She thought of all the times she had doubted herself, all the times she had wondered if any of her sacrifices had been worth it. And now she had her answer. That small act of kindness, one meal on a rainy night, had been the spark that changed everything. The next morning, Emily woke up feeling lighter than she had in years. The events of the previous night played over and over in her mind, but each time it seemed more real. The key to the new apartment sat on her nightstand, glinting in the soft morning light. She had spent the night thinking about her future, about what this new chapter might hold. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to dream. Maybe things could be different. Maybe there was still a chance for her and her mother to have a better life. After making breakfast for her mother, Emily called the building manager of the new apartment complex to arrange a tour. She didn't know what to expect, but the excitement bubbling in her chest was undeniable. That afternoon, she found herself standing outside a sleek, modern building in a part of town she had never imagined living in. The area was quiet, with tree-lined streets and well-maintained sidewalks, the kind of place that felt worlds away from her current neighborhood. As the building manager led her through the spacious, sun-lit apartment, Emily felt tears prick the corners of her eyes. The apartment was beautiful. Large windows, hardwood floors, a small balcony with a view of the park. It felt like a dream, like a life she had never thought she could have. And yet, here it was, within reach. She stood in the living room, staring out at the park below, her heart swelling with gratitude. She thought of Marcus, of how his journey had brought him back to her doorstep, and how their lives had intersected in such a profound way. As the wind rustled the leaves outside, Emily smiled softly to herself. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. Kindness had the power to change lives. And hers had just begun again. That evening, back in her old apartment, Emily sat with her mother at the kitchen table, a gentle smile on her face. Her mother was humming softly to herself, unaware of the monumental shift that had just occurred in their lives. But Emily didn't mind. She would explain it all in time. For now, she was content just to sit there, basking in the warmth of the moment. The weight of the past few years, the hardships, the doubt, the struggle, was still there. But it was lighter now. She had been given a second chance, a chance she never saw coming. And it all stemmed from a single act of kindness that had rippled through the years, touching lives in ways she could never have predicted. As the evening wore on and the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily's mind wandered back to Marcus's words. "You gave me hope." She smiled to herself, feeling a deep sense of peace. Maybe that's what life was really about, finding ways to give each other hope, even when everything seemed lost. Because sometimes, hope was all you needed to start over. The weeks following Marcus's visit felt surreal to Emily, as though she had stepped into a new life. One where things didn't just break down, but instead had a way of coming together. The weight of uncertainty that had dominated her days for years was still there, lingering at the edges, but it no longer crushed her. In its place, a glimmer of hope had bloomed, bright and steady, offering her something she hadn't allowed herself to believe in for so long: possibility. The new apartment was everything Emily had never dared to dream of. Situated in a peaceful neighborhood, it felt like a world away from the cramped, rundown place she had called home for so many years. Every time she stepped into the spacious living room, with its high ceilings and soft light filtering through the large windows, she felt a sense of gratitude so profound it was almost overwhelming. Moving in had been a whirlwind. Marcus had arranged for everything: the movers, the furniture, even the small details like the fresh flowers on the kitchen counter the day she and her mother arrived. The first night in the new apartment, as they sat together on the couch, her mother gazing out at the city skyline with a look of quiet contentment, Emily realized just how much their lives had changed. For the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe. But even in this newfound peace, Emily hadn't forgotten where she came from. She still worked at the reading nook, grateful for the steady income and the sense of purpose it brought her. Claire had been overjoyed when she heard about Emily's new apartment, insisting on coming over with a bottle of wine and a stack of books to help her settle in properly. Their friendship had deepened in the months since Emily started at the bookstore, and Emily often found herself marveling at how life, despite its harshness, had a way of bringing people back into your orbit when you needed them most. And then, of course, there was Marcus. They kept in touch after that first night. Though not in the way Emily might have expected. Marcus was a busy man, his schedule packed with training, games, and media appearances. But he never let too much time go by without checking in. Sometimes it was a simple text message: "How's the new place?" Other times it was a phone call late at night when the world had quieted down and they could talk without distractions. Emily found that, despite the gulf between their lives, their conversations felt easy, natural. They talked about everything: his career, her work at the bookstore, the challenges they had both faced, and the people who had shaped them along the way. One evening, a few weeks after she had settled into her new apartment, Marcus called unexpectedly. It was late, almost midnight, but Emily had always been a night owl and she answered the phone with a smile. "Hey Marcus," she said, leaning back on the couch, her feet tucked under a blanket. "What's going on? Aren't you supposed to be sleeping before a big game tomorrow?" Marcus chuckled softly on the other end of the line. "Yeah, but I couldn't sleep. Just had a lot on my mind." "Everything okay?" "Yeah, it's just, I've been thinking a lot about the past, about how everything could have gone so differently, you know? One or two things change, and I might not be where I am now. And I keep coming back to you, Emily." Emily felt a warmth spread through her chest, but she didn't quite know how to respond. She still struggled with the enormity of what Marcus credited her for. How a single meal, given on a whim, had set him on a path that led to success. "Marcus, you've done all this yourself," she said quietly. "You put in the work, you made the right choices. I was just a small part of the journey." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was soft but firm. "You were the first part. That night, when you gave me that meal, it was like someone finally saw me, not as some homeless kid, but as a person worth helping. That made all the difference." Emily blinked away the tears that sprang to her eyes. She had come to understand that while her act of kindness may have been small in the grand scheme of things, to Marcus, it had been a lifeline. And knowing that made her feel like somehow all the struggle had been worth it. "Anyway," Marcus continued, his voice lightening, "I was thinking I've been doing a lot with my charity work lately, especially with kids in tough situations. And I was wondering if you might want to get involved." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "Me? How?" "Well, I'm expanding a program to help homeless and at-risk kids. It's a combination of education, sports, and mentoring. I know you've got a lot going on, but I thought you might like to help. Your story could really inspire these kids." Emily was silent for a moment, the weight of the offer settling over her. She had always thought of herself as someone who was barely scraping by, someone whose story was more about survival than success. But maybe that was exactly what these kids needed to hear. That life didn't always have to be about grand achievements. Sometimes just surviving, just being kind was enough. "I'd love that," she said finally, her voice soft but sure. "I don't know what I could offer, but if you think it'll help, I'm in." Marcus's voice was warm with gratitude. "I know it'll help, thanks, Emily. You've already done more than you know." A few months later, Emily found herself standing in front of a group of young kids at a community center in the heart of Cleveland. The room buzzed with energy. Some of the kids had just come off the basketball court, their faces flushed with excitement, while others lingered near the edges, watching with wary eyes. These were kids like Marcus had once been. Kids who were hanging on by a thread. Kids who had seen more hardship than they deserved. Emily felt nervous at first, unsure of what to say. She had never been one for public speaking, but Marcus stood nearby, giving her an encouraging nod. He had asked her to share her story with the group, and though she wasn't sure if it was what they needed to hear, she trusted Marcus's instinct. Taking a deep breath, she began. She told them about her life, about the choices she had made to care for her mother, about the struggles she faced. She didn't sugarcoat anything, because she knew these kids didn't need another polished success story. They needed to hear the truth. The raw, messy truth of what it meant to keep going, even when the odds were stacked against you. She spoke about the night she met Marcus, about how giving him that meal had been a simple act of kindness, one that had rippled out in ways she could never have imagined. And as she spoke, she saw something change in the kids' faces. The wariness faded, replaced by something softer. Hope, maybe. Understanding. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then slowly, one by one, the kids started to clap. It wasn't a loud, thunderous applause, but it was genuine, and that was all Emily needed. After the talk, Marcus came up to her, his face lit with pride. "You were amazing," he said, clapping her on the back. "I knew they'd connect with you." Emily smiled, feeling a warmth bloom in her chest. "I just hope it helps," she said. "Even if it's just one kid." "It will," Marcus said, his voice full of certainty. "Trust me, it will." That evening, Emily returned to her apartment, exhausted but content. Her mother was already asleep, the apartment quiet and peaceful. Emily sat by the window, looking out at the city below, her mind replaying the events of the day. She thought about Marcus, about the kids at the community center, about the long and winding road that had brought her to this point. She had spent so many years doubting herself, questioning whether her sacrifices had been worth it. But now she realized that every choice she had made, every struggle she had endured, had led her here, and in that she found a deep sense of peace. As she sat there, watching the lights of the city twinkle in the distance, she thought again of the boy she had met so long ago. A boy who had become a man, who had come back into her life to show her that kindness, no matter how small, could change the world. Emily smiled to herself, feeling a quiet sense of fulfillment wash over her. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't worried about the future. She had learned that life had a way of surprising you, of bringing people back into your world when you needed them most. And she had learned that sometimes, the simplest acts of kindness could ripple out in ways you never imagined. Because in the end, it wasn't about grand gestures or perfect moments. It was about the small things, the moments of compassion, the choices to help, the belief that even in the hardest times, there was always hope. And that, Emily thought, was enough.